My parents changed the locks while I was at work and said I had 24 hours to move out. Now they are begging me to go back. My parents changed the locks while I was at work in March and left a note saying I had 24 hours to collect my belongings or they'd throw everything away. I'd been living there for 6 months after college while saving for my own place and paying them $800 monthly rent. I came home from my shift at the hospital to find my key didn't work, and a note taped to the door saying they decided to renovate my room into a home gym, and I needed to be out by tomorrow night. No warning, no discussion, just locked out of the house I'd grown up in with all my possessions held hostage inside. When I called my mother, she said they'd been patient long enough and it was time for me to be independent. I reminded her I was paying rent and had never missed a payment, but she said that didn't matter because adult children shouldn't live with parents regardless of the arrangement. She said they wanted their privacy back and deserved to enjoy their empty nest years without me hanging around. My father got on the phone and said they'd already bought gym equipment that was being delivered in 2 days, so I needed to hurry up and clear out. I asked why they couldn't have given me 30 days notice like legal tenants require, and he laughed, saying I wasn't a tenant, I was their kid, and they didn't owe me anything. My mother said they'd left work at noon to change the locks and pack some of my clothes in garbage bags that were sitting in the garage. She said I should be grateful they hadn't just donated everything to charity immediately. She actually said I was lucky they were being so generous with 24 hours when they could have given me nothing. They refused to let me in that night, saying they needed their space, and I could come back tomorrow with a moving truck. I had to sleep in my car in their driveway while all my belongings were locked inside. My father came out at midnight and told me to move my car because the neighbors might think they were having problems if they saw me sleeping outside. He suggested I get a hotel like a real adult would. The next day I showed up with friends to help me move, and my parents had put maybe a quarter of my belongings in the garage. When I asked where everything else was, my mother said they'd already started renovating and threw away anything that looked old or unnecessary. My computer setup, my college textbooks, my grandmother's jewelry she'd left me, all gone because they decided I didn't need them. They stood there watching us load what little remained into the truck, and my mother actually said she was proud of me for finally growing up. She said being forced out was the push I needed to become successful. My father added that they'd done me a favor because comfort made people lazy, and now I'd have to work harder. They were smiling like they'd given me a gift instead of making me homeless with 1 day's notice. That's when I decided to show them what losing comfort actually meant. I started by calling Adult Protective Services and reporting that my elderly parents were showing signs of cognitive decline. I said they'd been making irrational decisions like destroying property and changing locks without warning. I mentioned they'd thrown away valuable items, including family heirlooms, and seemed confused about tenant law. I suggested someone should check on them regularly to ensure they were capable of living independently. A PS started visiting weekly, which my parents found humiliating and invasive. Next, I canceled all the tech support I'd been providing them for years. When their internet stopped working, they called me for help, and I said I only helped family, and they'd made it clear I wasn't welcome as family. I also stopped paying for their streaming services that were in my name. They didn't realize Netflix, Hulu, Prime, and HBO were all on my accounts until everything stopped working. My mother called demanding I fix it, and I said those were for family members who lived together, and since I didn't live there anymore, they weren't entitled to my services. The real consequence came when they needed someone to drive them to medical appointments. My father's license got suspended for speeding tickets, and my mother never learned to drive. They called me, assuming I'd take time off work to chauffeur them around. I said I was too busy being independent and successful like they'd wanted. I suggested they use expensive ride services like real adults would. They had to pay hundreds of dollars weekly for rides to appointments, grocery stores, and social events. Then their gym equipment arrived, but they couldn't figure out how to assemble it. They called me for help, and I reminded them that my room was no longer my room, so their gym was no longer my problem. They had to hire someone to assemble everything, which cost $500. The equipment sat unused because neither of them actually wanted to exercise. They just wanted to hurt me by taking my room. 6 months later, they are demanding that I go back. My mother called me at work 3 days later. My phone lit up during a busy shift, and I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. She was crying so hard I could barely understand her at first. She said they couldn't afford the ride services anymore, and my father had missed a doctor's appointment because they had no way to get there. She kept saying I was being cruel and unreasonable. She said family helps family, and I needed to stop punishing them for one mistake. I felt my hands start shaking while I held the phone. Other nurses were moving past me in the hallway, and I stepped into an empty patient room so no one could hear. I cut her off mid-sentence and told her that throwing away my grandmother's jewelry and giving me 24 hours notice wasn't one mistake. It was a series of choices they made on purpose. They changed the locks while I was at work. They threw away my belongings without asking. They smiled while I loaded garbage bags into a truck. I hung up before she could start with the guilt trip about how I should be grateful they raised me. My whole body was shaking when I came out of that room. Raina was walking past and she stopped when she saw my face. She grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the break room without saying anything. I sat down at the table and just started talking. I told her everything from the beginning, the note on the door, sleeping in my car, watching them throw away my grandmother's jewelry like it was trash. Raina listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she was quiet for a minute. Then she said my parents sounded like they were facing real consequences, but that didn't mean I had to rescue them. She said consequences were supposed to be uncomfortable or people never learned anything. She offered to be my buffer if they started showing up at the hospital. I thanked her, but figured they wouldn't actually come to my workplace. That seemed too crazy even for them. 2 days later, I was checking vitals on a patient when someone at the desk told me I had visitors in the lobby. I walked down there and saw both my parents standing near the entrance. My mother was wearing her church clothes like she'd dressed up for this. My father had his arms crossed and that look on his face that meant he was ready to argue. They started walking toward me before I could turn around. My mother said they needed to talk to me right now, and my father said I'd been ignoring their calls long enough. I told them I was working and they needed to leave. My mother said this couldn't wait, and my father said I owed them 5 minutes after everything they'd done for me. My supervisor came over because other people in the lobby were starting to stare. She asked my parents if they needed help finding someone, and my mother said she was trying to talk to her daughter. My supervisor told them they could wait in the lobby until my break, or they could leave. My father actually started arguing with her about his right to see me. He raised his voice and said nobody was going to keep him from his own daughter. Security came over, and my supervisor had to ask them directly to leave the building. My father kept arguing, even with security standing right there. He said this was ridiculous, and they just needed 5 minutes. My mother finally grabbed his arm and pulled him toward the door. She was crying again and looking back at me like I was the one being unreasonable. I stood behind the nurses' station watching them leave and felt my face burning. Everyone had seen that. My coworkers, patients, random people in the lobby. My supervisor came over after they were gone and asked if I was okay. She said if this was going to be an ongoing problem, we should get HR involved. I told her I hoped it wouldn't happen again, but I'd let her know if it did. She squeezed my shoulder and told me to take a few minutes before going back to my patient. I went to the bathroom and splashed cold water on my face. My hands were still shaking. That weekend, my aunt called me. I hadn't talked to her in months. She said my parents had asked her to call me and she wanted to hear my side before she took a position. I felt relieved that someone was actually asking for my version instead of just believing whatever my parents told them. I explained the whole thing, the locks, the 24-hour deadline, all my stuff they threw away. I told her about my grandmother's jewelry and my computer, and how they stood there smiling while I loaded garbage bags. There was a long silence on the phone. Then my aunt said she had no idea it happened that way. She said my parents told everyone I'd moved out after they asked me nicely to find my own place. They made it sound like I'd chosen to leave and was now holding a grudge over normal parent stuff. My aunt sounded upset. She asked if I had any proof because this was really serious. I remembered I'd taken pictures that day, mostly because I was so shocked by the garbage bags and the note. I sent her the photos right then while we were still on the phone. The garbage bags lined up in the garage, the note taped to the door with the 24-hour deadline, the empty space where my computer setup used to be. My aunt was quiet again after she looked at them. Then she said she was horrified. She said she'd talked to other family members because my parents had been painting themselves as victims of an ungrateful daughter. She said people needed to know the truth. Within a few days, the family group chat turned into chaos. I wasn't in that chat anymore because I'd left it months ago, but my cousin started texting me screenshots. Everyone was arguing about what really happened. My aunt had shared the photos, and suddenly people were taking sides. Some relatives I hadn't heard from in years started calling me. Most of them were supportive, but a few told me I should forgive my parents because family was family. One uncle said I was being dramatic and should just move back home and work things out. I told him he was welcome to let my parents live with him if he thought they were so easy to deal with. He stopped calling after that. My parents showed up at my apartment 3 days later. I heard pounding on the door around 8 at night. My father was yelling through the door that I was turning everyone against them with lies. He kept pounding and yelling, and I could hear my mother saying something but couldn't make out the words. My landlord lived in the building, and he came up the stairs asking what was going on. My father turned on him and said this was between him and his daughter. My landlord said he didn't care, and if they didn't leave right now, he was calling the police. My father got angrier and stepped toward him. My mother grabbed my father's arm and started pulling him back toward the stairs. She was crying and saying they should just go. My landlord stood there until they got in their car and drove away. Then he asked me if I wanted him to call the police anyway. I said no, but thanked him for helping. The next morning I came out to go to work and my car had a flat tire. I walked around it looking for a nail or something obvious, but couldn't see anything. The timing felt really suspicious, but I couldn't prove they did it. I called Raina because I didn't know who else to ask. Her husband Roy said he'd come help me change it. He showed up 20 minutes later with a jack and tools. While we were working, he asked me about the situation with my parents. I gave him the short version. He said I should document everything in case I needed a restraining order later. That sounded extreme to me, and I told him so. He said showing up at my workplace and home after being told to stop was actually harassment. He said it might not feel that serious yet, but these things could get worse. I thanked him for the help and told him I'd think about it. My mother called me from an urgent care place a week later. She said my father had fallen at home and she had no way to get him to the emergency room for x-rays. I could hear my father in the background making these pain sounds. My mother was begging me to come drive them. She said he was really hurt and they needed help right now. I stood in my kitchen for 10 minutes trying to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to tell her to figure it out herself. Part of me felt sick thinking about my father actually being hurt. I finally called an ambulance for them. It cost them money, but at least he'd get help. I texted my mother the confirmation number and didn't say anything else. She texted back a long message about how a real daughter would have driven them herself. She said the ambulance bill was going to cost hundreds of dollars they didn't have. She said their budget was already tight from all the ride services, and now this was going to make everything worse. She said I was being selfish and cruel when they needed me most. I didn't reply to any of it. But later that night I called the hospital and asked about my father. The nurse said he had a sprained ankle and some bruised ribs, but nothing serious. I felt guilty for calling to check on him. I also felt relieved that I hadn't rushed over there. I sat on my couch afterward feeling confused about all of it. They'd kicked me out and destroyed my stuff, and now I was still worried about them getting hurt. It didn't make any sense, but I couldn't turn off the feeling completely. 2 weeks went by without any calls or surprise visits. I started to think they'd finally gotten the message and accepted that I wasn't coming back to rescue them from problems they'd created. I picked up extra shifts at the hospital and started looking at nicer apartments in better neighborhoods. Then I got home from work one Tuesday and found an envelope taped to my door with a law firm's return address. Inside was a letter on official letterhead demanding payment of back rent for the 18 years I'd lived at home as a minor. The lawyer claimed my parents had provided room and board without compensation and were owed approximately $200,000 in unpaid rent calculated at market rates. I stood in my kitchen reading it 3 times because I couldn't believe they'd actually hired someone to send this garbage. The letter threatened legal action if I didn't respond within 14 days. I took a photo of it and texted it to Raina asking if Roy could look at it. He called me 20 minutes later actually laughing. He said it was the most ridiculous thing he'd seen in years, and completely unenforceable since parents have a legal obligation to the house their minor children. He said any lawyer who sent that letter was either incompetent or didn't care about wasting my parents' money. He asked if I wanted him to have a friend who practiced law respond officially. I said yes because I was done letting them think they could intimidate me with legal threats. Roy's friend drafted a cease and desist letter that laid out everything in detail. The illegal eviction with 24 hours notice, the destruction of my property including family heirlooms, the harassment at my workplace and home, the frivolous legal threats. It stated clearly that I had grounds to sue them for the destroyed belongings and illegal eviction, but was choosing not to pursue action at this time. It warned that any further contact would result in filing for a restraining order and pursuing all available legal remedies. Roy said his friend sent it certified mail, so they'd have to sign for it. 3 days later, my aunt texted me asking what was going on. She said my parents were telling everyone I'd threatened to sue them and take their house. I sent her a copy of both letters so she could see what actually happened. She didn't respond for hours and then just sent back a message saying she needed time to process everything. The family group chat started blowing up again with people taking sides. Some relatives said I was being vindictive and should just forgive them. Others said my parents had brought this on themselves and needed to leave me alone. My mother's sister posted that family should always help family no matter what. I replied that family shouldn't change locks and throw away dead grandmother's jewelry either. But here we were. My aunt texted me privately 2 days later saying their lawyer had dropped them as clients. Apparently once he realized they'd illegally evicted me and destroyed my property, he wanted nothing to do with the case. She said my parents were furious and claiming the lawyer was incompetent. I felt satisfied that at least someone had told them they were wrong even if they wouldn't accept it. Raina invited me over for dinner the following weekend. I almost said no because I was tired of talking about my parents, but she insisted it would be good for me to spend time with normal family dynamics. Her husband Roy grilled burgers in the backyard while their daughter Mariana helped set the table. We ate outside on their patio, and it felt strange being around a family that actually seemed to like each other. After dinner, Mariana asked me directly if I ever missed my parents despite everything they'd done. The question caught me off guard because most people tried to avoid the subject or gave me sympathy. I thought about it for a minute while Roy and Raina watched me carefully. I told her I missed the parents I thought I had, the ones who wouldn't throw away my grandmother's jewelry or lock me out without warning. But those people apparently never existed, and I was grieving a fantasy version that didn't match reality. Mariana nodded like that made sense to her. She said her friend's parents got divorced, and her friend had to grieve the family she thought she had, even though both parents were still alive. It felt good to have someone understand without making it complicated. Roy changed the subject to a movie they wanted to see, and the rest of the evening felt normal in a way my family gatherings never had. The next week, someone knocked on my door while I was getting ready for work. I looked through the peephole and saw my younger cousin standing there holding an envelope. I opened the door and she looked uncomfortable. She handed me the envelope and said my parents asked her to deliver it. I asked if she'd read it and she shook her head but said they'd made her promise to wait for a response. I opened it right there while she stood in the hallway. It was a handwritten letter from my mother begging for reconciliation. Every sentence made me angrier than the last. She wrote that she was sorry I felt hurt by their decision, that mistakes were made on both sides, that families should forgive and move forward. There was no acknowledgement of what they'd actually done wrong. No mention of changing the locks or destroying my belongings, or giving me 24 hours notice. No offer to replace what they'd thrown away. Just vague non-apology phrases, and demands that I forgive them and come back to help with their mounting problems. The letter ended by saying they needed me and family was supposed to be there for each other. I looked at my cousin and asked if she knew what they'd done to me. She said she'd heard different versions from different people. I gave her the short version right there in my doorway. How they'd changed the locks while I was at work. How they'd thrown away my grandmother's jewelry and my computer. How they'd given me one day to get out. Her eyes got wide and she said she had no idea it was that bad. I told her to go back and tell them I'd think about responding. She left looking upset, and I went back inside feeling exhausted. I spent 2 days writing a response letter. I made a detailed list of what actual amends would look like. A real apology that named their specific actions instead of vague phrases about mistakes being made. Reimbursement for my grandmother's jewelry and destroyed belongings with specific dollar amounts. A commitment to respecting my boundaries going forward, including no surprise visits and no demands for free labor. I wrote that these weren't negotiation points or requests. They were minimum requirements for any future relationship. I made it clear I was prepared to maintain no contact permanently if they couldn't meet them. I printed it out and put it in an envelope. Then I texted my cousin asking if she'd deliver one more thing. She came by that evening, and I handed her the envelope. I told her to make sure both my parents read it carefully. She promised she would and left. I felt better having stated my terms clearly, even though I doubted they'd actually follow through. My father called me directly for the first time in months. His name showed up on my phone, and I almost didn't answer. I finally picked up on the fourth ring and didn't say anything. He started talking immediately, and his voice sounded different, tired and defeated instead of angry. He said they'd gotten my letter and read it multiple times. He admitted they'd made serious mistakes and handled everything wrong. Then he said something that surprised me. He told me converting my room to a gym was my mother's idea that he went along with because he didn't want to argue with her. He said he'd realized their marriage had problems that had nothing to do with me, but I'd gotten caught in the crossfire. He sounded like he'd been thinking about this for a while. I didn't know what to say, so I just listened. He kept talking about how things had gotten out of control and he understood why I was angry. It was the first time either of them had actually acknowledged what they'd done without making excuses. I asked him directly if he understood that changing the locks and throwing away my belongings was cruel and illegal. There was a long pause on the other end. Then he said yes. Just that one word, but it felt significant. He offered to pay me back for the destroyed items in monthly installments since they couldn't afford a lump sum. He asked if I'd be willing to have coffee with just him to talk about what a limited relationship might look like. I told him I'd think about it and call him back. We hung up and I sat on my couch feeling confused. Part of me wanted to say no and keep the boundaries firm. Part of me was curious if he was actually capable of change. I called Raina and told her about the conversation. She said it was up to me, but suggested meeting in a public place if I decided to do it. I thought about it for 3 days before texting my father that I'd meet him for coffee, but this didn't mean everything was fixed. We met at a coffee shop downtown on a Saturday morning. I got there early and picked a table near the window where other people could see us. My father showed up exactly on time carrying a folder. He looked older than I remembered. We got coffee and sat down, and he pulled out a check from the folder. It was the first installment for the destroyed belongings. Then he showed me a list he'd made of everything he remembered them throwing away. My computer and monitor, my college textbooks, my grandmother's jewelry with descriptions of each piece, kitchen items I'd bought, clothes and shoes. He'd clearly put actual thought into this, which surprised me. We talked for almost 2 hours about what a limited relationship could look like. I made it clear I wasn't moving back or becoming their on-call helper. I wouldn't tolerate guilt trips or surprise visits. He agreed to everything and said he'd talk to my mother about respecting boundaries, even though she was still angry about the family finding out the truth. I left feeling cautiously hopeful, but not ready to let my guard down completely. We established a new arrangement over the next few weeks through phone calls and texts. I agreed to help them find affordable transportation solutions and set up their technology one more time, but I made it clear this was a one-time thing and I wasn't their free tech support or driver. I told my father I wouldn't tolerate my mother's passive-aggressive comments and would leave immediately if she started. He said he understood and would back me up. The first time I went over to help them research senior transportation services, my mother barely spoke to me. She sat at the kitchen table with her arms crossed while I showed them websites for ride programs and discounted services for people over 65. My father asked questions and took notes, but my mother just stared at the wall. When I was packing up to leave, she made a comment about how nice it must be to have so much free time. I picked up my bag and headed for the door. My father actually told her to stop and apologize to me. My mother got up and walked out of the room. I told my father I'd come back another time to finish helping, but only if he could keep her comments under control. Over the next month, I went over 3 more times on my schedule to help them. I taught my mother basic smartphone skills so she could schedule rides herself using the apps we'd found. She complained the whole time about technology being too complicated and young people being impatient. I ignored most of it and just kept showing her the steps. My father sat with us and learned too, so he could help her when I wasn't there. The second time, my mother made a passive-aggressive comment about how some daughters would just drive their parents instead of making them use apps. My father told her to stop and she got up and left the room again. The third time, she actually made it through the whole session without major comments. My father walked me to the door afterward and thanked me for being patient. He said my mother was struggling with accepting that things had changed, and she couldn't just demand I fix everything for them anymore. I told him that was her problem to work through, and I wasn't going to sacrifice my boundaries to make her comfortable. He nodded and said he was working on it. 3 months passed with our careful arrangement staying mostly in place. My father called one afternoon while I was folding laundry in my apartment and told me they'd put the house on the market. He said they found a smaller condo closer to the bus lines and grocery stores, so they wouldn't need to rely on expensive ride services anymore. His voice sounded different from usual, less defensive and more matter-of-fact. He thanked me for not rescuing them when things got hard, because it forced them to actually solve their problems, instead of just expecting me to fix everything. My mother sent a text 2 days later saying the move was for the best. It wasn't an apology and I didn't expect one at this point, but it was the closest she'd come to admitting they'd made mistakes. The text was only 1 sentence long and she didn't add anything about missing me or wanting me to visit more often. I saved it anyway because it felt like progress, even if it was tiny. I drove to their new condo on a Saturday morning after they'd been settled in for a few weeks. The building was plain brick with a small parking lot and an elevator that smelled like cleaning products. Their unit was on the second floor, and maybe half the size of the house. My father showed me around, pointing out the kitchen that barely fit 2 people, and the living room where their old couch looked too big for the space. His office was actually just a corner desk in the second bedroom with his computer and some books on a shelf. The gym equipment was completely gone. He said they donated it to a community center since they never used it, and it wouldn't fit in the condo anyway. My mother stayed in the kitchen making coffee and didn't offer to give me a tour herself. We had dinner together that night at a restaurant nearby, and the conversation was polite but strained. My father asked about my work, and I told him about a difficult patient case. My mother mentioned their new neighbors and complained about the thin walls. Nobody brought up the past 6 months directly. We tried monthly dinners after that, and some went fine, while others ended with my mother making a comment about how I never call enough, or my father suggesting I should visit more often. I started leaving early when the old patterns showed up, because I wasn't going to sit there and get guilt-tripped. Our relationship stayed careful and limited, with clear boundaries that I enforced every time they tested them. It wasn't the close family dynamic other people seem to have, but it was honest about what we actually were to each other. That felt better than pretending everything was fine when I knew exactly how little they'd valued me before I forced them to see consequences.